Between 1939 and 1945, the planet was scenario of the most extensive and devastating conflict of the 20th century. The Second World War marked humanity with facts that still shake. The Holocaust, the bombings over entire cities, and the atomic explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Along those years of terrestrial, naval, and aerial confrontations, it is calculated that died between 50 and 70 million of people. However, besides its tragedy, that period boosted a technological transformation without precedents. Each country involved converted science into military tool, and from that competition emerged weapons, vehicles, communication systems, and medical products that, with the time, passed to civil life. The war laboratories generated advances in pharmacology, food storage, and industrial design that still sustain entire sectors of the modern economy. From that stage of violence and experimentation emerged innovations that today are integrated in the daily routine and that molded great part of the contemporary technical and social progress. Which were some of those creations born in the war that still influence in our daily life? The Kunche intramedullary nail, from the Reichshospitals to modern surgery. The German military hospitals were overflowing. Each offensive left thousands of wounded with fractures that kept them immobile for months. In that critical scenario emerged the proposal of a German surgeon, Gerhard Kunche, who proposed something that few considered viable: to repair a broken bone from within by means of a metallic tube inserted in its canal. What initially seemed a risky experiment ended up becoming the starting point of modern traumatology. Kunche, born in 1900 in Germany, had specialized in orthopedic surgery in the 1930s. Before the conflict, he had already observed how conventional treatments left patients months bedridden. Femur fractures were especially problematic. The bones displaced easily, the cast loosened, and the muscles lost strength. His objective was to find a method that would give internal stability to the bone without forcing to keep it immobile. In 1939, when the German army was already preparing to expand the war, Kunche presented a model of metallic rod designed to be introduced inside the bone canal. It was of polished steel, hollow, with a longitudinal slit that gave it flexibility. The procedure consisted of opening a small incision, aligning the fracture and sliding the nail inside until the ends were firm. The idea was that the bone would heal around the metal, this acting as an internal axis that would keep it straight and stable. The German medical community received the invention with skepticism. Many colleagues considered it a dangerous imprudence. In the first attempts, Kunche had to operate almost in secret, inside field hospitals where resources were scarce and the urgency enormous. The conditions were precarious: improvised stretchers, limited instruments, and rudimentary anesthesia. Even so, the results were so good that patients recovered in half the time. When the war intensified, the army needed soldiers who could return to the front as soon as possible. Kunche's method offered just that. Fractures treated with intramedullary nails consolidated in few weeks, and soldiers who before were incapacitated could reincorporate to combat. Towards 1942, the technique extended through the military hospitals of the Reich. The Army's own Ministry of Health approved the production of thousands of units. Field operating rooms began to receive boxes of nails made of surgical steel, sterilized and ready to use. Kunche personally supervised the manufacturing to guarantee exact measures according to the bone, different diameters and lengths for femur, tibia, or humerus. In each operation, surgeons used hammers and extractors designed by him. Although the environment was rudimentary and resources limited, the standardization of the instruments allowed rapid and efficient interventions, which notably accelerated the patient's initial mobility and reduced complications associated with prolonged immobility. The success of the method generated a network of military doctors specifically trained in the technique. Each field hospital had its own traumatology team. The reports that arrived in Berlin showed surprisingly high recovery rates. Despite the chaos of the war, medical innovation continued advancing. Kunche understood that his invention was useful not only for the army, but for all civil medicine. For that reason, he documented each case in detail: patient's age, type of fracture, consolidation time, and complications. When the war ended, the Allies found in the German hospitals hundreds of soldiers who walked with intramedullary nails in their legs. The British and American doctors were astonished. In little time, they translated Kuntscha's reports and began to apply his method in their own countries. The principle was universal: to stabilize the bone from within. During the following years, the procedure adapted with new materials. Titanium alloys were used, lighter and more resistant. X-ray techniques were also incorporated to control the position of the nail without needing to open large incisions. Surgery became more precise, less invasive, and much safer. Even so, the basic design of the nail remained the same as the one Kuntscha had devised in 1939. In the decade of the 1950s, civil hospitals began to use it massively. Traffic accidents, work falls, and sports fractures were now treated with internal fixation. The technique drastically reduced recovery times and complications due to immobility. In some cases, the nail was removed after consolidation. In others, it was left inside the bone for life, without causing discomfort. The impact of the invention was so great that Kuntscha was invited to give conferences in several European countries. His name began to appear in orthopedics manuals. However, his life remained discreet. After the war, he established himself in Lübeck, where he directed a hospital and continued teaching until his death in 1972. He never sought political or military recognition. His interest was purely medical. The principle of the intramedullary nail became the basis of all modern orthopedic surgery. From its design were born the current systems of locked internal fixation, where the nails carry transversal screws that prevent their rotation. It also inspired the minimally invasive techniques that are performed today in high-tech operating rooms. Kuntscha's original method demonstrated that a bone could be stabilized from within without casts, without traction, and without months of rest. In the actuality, intramedullary nails are manufactured with biocompatible materials and advanced sterilization. They are placed by means of image navigation, with incisions of barely some centimeters. In modern hospitals, the patient can walk the day after surgery. Despite the advances, the principle continues being the same that surgeon devised in the fields of war: to sustain the bone from its own center, to allow the body to recover by itself. More than 8 decades later, Kuntscha's legacy is in each traumatology room of the world. Millions of people have recovered their mobility thanks to his idea. What began as a war tool to return soldiers to the front ended up being an instrument of peace, capable of returning movement and life to those who had lost it. The Buna S synthetic rubber, the Reich's invention that today continues in your car's tires. When Germany entered in war, its industrial machinery depended almost completely on natural rubber imported from Asia. The material was indispensable to manufacture tires, gaskets, hoses, footwear, cables, and all type of pieces that made tanks, airplanes, and trucks function. With the advance of the conflict and the maritime blockade imposed by the Allies, the supply routes were cut. The Nazis found themselves before a problem that threatened their war economy. Without rubber, the wheels would stop turning. It was then when a chemical conglomerate called IG Farben assumed a decisive mission for the regime: to create a synthetic version of rubber that could be produced within the Reich. The project was not new, but until that moment the tests had been unstable. The scientists of IG Farben resumed previous investigations based on butadiene and styrene compounds. In 1935, they achieved a promising result: an elastic substance resistant to heat and wear that could be molded into sheets and conserve its shape. They called it Buna S, abbreviation of butadiene and sodium, with the S for styrene. It was the first viable synthetic rubber at industrial scale. The finding coincided with the preparation of the Third Reich for total war, so the state became its main financier and client. From 1936 began to be built industrial plants dedicated exclusively to produce the new material. The most important was built in Schkopau, and shortly after others emerged in Luna, Huls and Auschwitz-Monowitz, all operated or supervised by IG Farben. These facilities incorporated large-scale polymerization processes and production chains designed specifically for Buna S, which allowed to manufacture increasingly uniform and stable batches, suitable for use in tires and industrial components. The chemical process of Buna S was complex and required a completely new production chain. It started from hydrocarbons derived from coal, which were converted into butadiene and then mixed with styrene in the presence of metallic catalysts. The result was an elastic mass that could be vulcanized with sulfur, just like natural rubber. Engineers developed machinery capable of laminating, cutting and pressing the material with precision. The first batches were used in military tires and in truck suspension systems. Soon it was verified that it resisted low temperatures better than tropical rubber, which made it ideal for the Eastern Front. IG Farben became a pillar of the Nazi economy. The company controlled all chemical production of the Reich: explosives, fuels, medicines and plastics. In the case of Buna S, its growth was so rapid that in 1942 it already produced tens of thousands of tons per year. German laboratories perfected the formula to make it more flexible and resistant. However, its success had a dark side. In the Auschwitz-Monowitz plant, the construction and maintenance of the facilities were done with forced labor of prisoners. Thousands of people died due to exhaustion, malnutrition, and inhuman conditions. The production of synthetic rubber, symbol of Nazi industrial power, was directly linked to the concentration camp system. Despite that background, from the technical point of view, Buna S marked a turning point. Its stability against heat and its capacity to withstand constant friction surpassed many natural materials. German scientists applied it not only in tires, but also in boot soles, hydraulic seals, engine gaskets, and electrical coatings. The material became so essential that at the end of the war, almost all the Reich's automotive fleet depended on it. Even airplanes and submarines carried parts manufactured with synthetic rubber. When Allied troops entered Germany, they confiscated IG Farben's archives and sent its engineers to work on similar projects in the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. The results were not long in replicating. In few years, Allied chemical industries adapted the process and began to produce their own versions of Buna S. In the United States, it was called GRS, Government Rubber Styrene, manufactured in large quantities during the war to supply the lack of natural rubber from Southeast Asia. That material, derived from the original German, became the base of the post-war North American automotive industry. With time, synthetic rubber ceased to be a military resource to become an indispensable civil product. Its composition was modified with additives that improved elasticity, adherence, and resistance to aging. From the decade of the 1950s, car, bus, and motorcycle tires began to be manufactured with mixtures derived from Buna S. The main advantage was the cost and durability. It did not depend on the climate nor on tropical plantations and could be produced in any country with access to oil or coal. The name of IG Farben disappeared after the war. Its executives were judged in Nuremberg for their participation in the regime's crimes and for the exploitation of prisoners. The company was dissolved and divided into several companies, among them BASF, Bayer and Hoechst, which continued developing chemical products for civil use. The knowledge accumulated during the Buna S project was not lost. Engineers trained in those plants took their experience to laboratories around the world, where they adapted the process to new polymers. In the following decades emerged derived materials like SBR, styrene butadiene rubber, still used today in the majority of commercial tires. From it were born more specialized variants for industrial applications: hydraulic hoses, footwear, floor mats, gaskets, and electrical components. In all those products survives the principle of Buna S, a mixture of styrene and butadiene that offers flexibility and resistance. Although the history of IG Farben is marked by the association with the Nazi regime, its development of synthetic rubber changed forever the relationship between chemistry and industry. What began as a desperate response to the isolation of the Reich ended up defining the global economy of plastic and elastomers. Today, no sector, neither automotive nor construction nor electronics, could function without materials derived from that experiment. The idea of manufacturing rubber without depending on nature transformed chemistry into a strategic tool and opened the way towards the modern polymer industry. Buna S demonstrated that it was possible to create artificial substitutes for limited resources, and that mentality marked the scientific development of the 20th century by boosting the systematic search for synthetic materials. Its evolution gave origin to SBR, which today constitutes one of the most used elastomers in the world. In the actuality, this material sustains complete industrial sectors. More than 60% of commercial tires are based on SBR mixtures. Construction employs it in adhesives, waterproofing agents, and modified asphalts. Electronics uses it in insulating coatings, and mass manufacturing integrates it in footwear, mechanical gaskets, flexible pipes, and automotive components. Contemporary reports from the International Rubber Study Group and technical studies published by publishers like Wiley show that SBR continues expanding thanks to its low cost, its stability and its capacity to be formulated for specific applications. Thus, that which began as an emergency solution in the Germany of 1935 ended up becoming one of the material pillars of the modern world, present in thousands of products that we use daily without being conscious of its historical origin. Reichsautobahn, the German work that inspired the world's highways. When the Nazi Party came to power in 1933, Germany still dragged the economic wounds of the post-war. Unemployment surpassed 6 million of people, and the promises of reactivation were an essential part of the political discourse. Among the projects that were presented as symbol of that rebirth was the Reichsautobahn, the national network of highways that would transform the German landscape and would become one of the visual emblems of the Third Reich. Although the idea of controlled access roads existed since the Weimar Republic, the regime adopted it and converted it into an instrument of propaganda, modernization, and control of the territory. Before Nazism, some experimental highways had already been built. The first was the AVUS, a road of 10 kilometers in Berlin, inaugurated in 1921 as a test and competition track. Shortly after, in 1932, a road between Cologne and Bonn was completed that already gathered several characteristics of modern highways. However, the high cost and the scarce number of automobiles caused the projects to remain on pause. The ideas of a national network were resumed by the organization Hafraba, founded in 1926 to plan an axis Hamburg-Frankfurt-Basel, but the economic crisis of the decade of the 1930s prevented its execution. When Hitler came to power, the project was absorbed by the new regime and its political authorship rewritten as a personal initiative of the Führer. The man in charge of directing the plan was the engineer Fritz Todt, named Inspector General of Roads of the Reich. In June of 1933, the law that officially established the Reichsautobahn program was approved, and on the 25th of August, the Gesellschaft Reichsautobahnen, the state company in charge of the works, was created. On the 23rd of September of that year, in a multitudinous act near Frankfurt, Hitler took a shovel and lifted the first portion of earth before the cameras. That scene was repeated in posters, newsreels and newspapers as a symbol of the new worker state. The roads were presented as Adolf Hitler's streets, a monument of modernity that linked the leader with technical progress and the overcoming of unemployment. The works officially began in the spring of 1934 in several points of the country. Todt organized the tasks in regional divisions, with worker camps that housed thousands of workers. The first sections united Frankfurt with Darmstadt and Munich with the southern regions. In 1935, the first operative segment was inaugurated, and in 1936, the first 1,000 kilometers had already been completed. Each opening was celebrated with ceremonies, parades, and the presence of high commands of the party. The roads, with their concrete pavement, wide curves and elevated passages, were designed not only for speed, but also to visually impress. At social level, the regime presented the construction of the Reichsautobahn as a great battle against unemployment. It was said that it employed hundreds of thousands of people, although in reality the figures were much lower. Salaries were low and working conditions harsh. The workers lived in barracks far from the cities, without access to basic services. The 11 or 12-hour days and the lack of adequate food caused exhaustion and frequent accidents. Internal reports registered that during the first 5 years, one worker died for every 6 kilometers of highway built. Even so, the regime's propaganda insisted that it was an example of harmony between the people and their leader. The construction pace increased until 1938. That year, with the annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland, the network expanded to more than 12,000 planned kilometers. Hitler again took the shovel in Salzburg to inaugurate the first Austrian section, reaffirming the territorial expansion of the Reich. The built sections connected large cities but still did not form a practical system for the transport of goods. Its value was more symbolic than economic. They showed the technical dominance of the regime and reinforced its image of modernity before the world. With the start of the war in 1939, priorities changed. Fritz Todt was assigned to the construction of the West Wall, the Siegfried Line, and the highway work slowed down. That year, only 237 new kilometers were added. The roads began to have a direct military use, serving as fast routes for the movement of troops and supplies. Sections were also adapted to serve as emergency landing strips. In 1941, the network reached almost 4,000 kilometers, and the works definitively stopped. The work on the Reichsautobahn exposed the authoritarian character of the Nazi system even in civil projects. The workers were under political surveillance, and those who complained could be interrogated by the Gestapo. There were strikes in several points, such as in Hamburg and Bremen, which were suppressed with arrests and punishments. To control discipline, units called Baustürmer were created, formed by members of the SA, in charge of maintaining order and serving as an example. From 1937, when full employment made it difficult to recruit workers, the regime resorted to forced labor, including young people from the Reich Labor Service and later prisoners and inmates from re-education camps. Despite the repressive background, the Reichsautobahn left a technical legacy that transcended the Third Reich. Its design norms, controlled accesses, lane separation and absence of same-level crossings became the model for modern highways. American engineers studied the captured plans after the war and used them as reference for the interstate system of the United States, initiated in the decade of the 1950s. In Europe, the reconstructed countries adopted similar principles for their new road networks. After the war, many sections of the Reichsautobahn continued to be used. Some were repaired and expanded, others served as a base for new routes. The current German highways, the Autobahnen, preserve part of the original layout designed in the 1930s. In some sections, the stone bridges and decorative railings still show the monumental style imposed by Todt and his architects. The Reichsautobahn ended up consolidating as an infrastructure that the regime employed to project discipline, modernity, and territorial control. Beyond its political function, its technical design, based on fluid layouts and segregated circulation, transcended the project itself. Decades later, those principles continue present in contemporary highways, which still reflect the influence of the model developed in the Reich. Horten Ho 229, the stealth aircraft that challenged radar. While the Allies dominated the European skies, a small group of German engineers worked in secret to alter the course of the conflict from an improvised workshop. The brothers Reimar and Walter Horten, pilots and designers, imagined an aircraft different from any other, without fuselage nor tail, only a wing in the shape of a boomerang capable of cutting the air with a minimum resistance. From that vision was born the Horten Ho 229, the most advanced aircraft of the Third Reich and the first real attempt to create a stealth aircraft, invisible to radar. The Hortens had experimented since the beginning of the decade of the 1930s with flying wing gliders. Germany, restricted by the Treaty of Versailles, could not manufacture military airplanes, so flight clubs became a refuge for hidden engineering. Reimar Horten designed gliders that eliminated the tail to reduce friction and tested them in competitions sponsored by the government. When the Luftwaffe was re-established, his experiments caught the attention of the High Command. The total wing design promised exceptional aerodynamic performance and lower fuel consumption, something vital in times of scarcity. In 1943, Marshal Hermann Göring launched Project 1000x3, which demanded a bomber capable of transporting 1 ton of bombs, traveling 1,600 kilometers and reaching 1,000 kilometers per hour. The Hortens presented their proposal, a fighter bomber without fuselage, propelled by 2 Junkers Jumo 004B jet engines, the same as the Me 262. The wing shape reduced resistance and allowed higher speeds with less power. Göring approved the design and classified it as a secret project. The first prototype, Ho 9 Phi-1, was a motorless glider that flew in March of 1944. Its performance exceeded expectations, and immediately a version with propulsion was ordered to be manufactured. In December of the same year, the Ho 9 Phi-2 flew, reaching almost 1,000 kilometers per hour. The fuselage, composed largely of wood due to lack of aluminum, was reinforced with a resin impregnated with carbon powder, a material that helped reduce the reflection of British radar waves. Without knowing it, the Hortens were applying principles that stealth technology would develop decades later. The aircraft behaved with surprising stability. It lacked a vertical rudder, direction was controlled with air brakes at the wingtips, and elevons combined roll and pitch. It included retractable landing gear, a brake parachute, and a primitive ejection seat. With its wingspan of 16.7 meters and its loaded weight of 9 tons, it was a medium-sized apparatus designed for a single pilot. In internal tests, a maximum speed close to 977 kilometers per hour and a ceiling of 16,000 meters were calculated. However, the program suffered delays. In February of 1945, test pilot Erwin Ziller crashed after an engine failure. The loss of the prototype was a severe blow, but the Air Ministry ordered to continue. 20 pre-production units were planned under the official name Gotha Go 229, manufactured by the company Gotha Wagenfabrik. Allied bombings and the collapse of the Reich prevented completing more than 3 structures. In April of 1945, when American troops occupied the center of Germany, they found in Friedrichroda the prototype Phi 3 in assembly phase. It was captured by the 8th Army Corps of the US and transferred within Operation Paperclip, along with engineers and design documents. The aircraft immediately caught the attention of the Northrop Company, which was already studying similar configurations. During the post-war, the Ho 229 was thoroughly analyzed in American military facilities. Meanwhile, the Horten family was interrogated. Reimar emigrated to Argentina, where he continued developing experimental gliders. Walter stayed in Germany and worked in civil aviation. None returned to build a warplane, but their total wing concept influenced later generations. The legacy of the Ho 229 was direct. Northrop engineers, inspired by the German plans, initiated a series of flying wing prototypes, the N1M, the N9M, and later the YB-35 bomber. Although these projects did not prosper then, they established the basis for the design of the B-2 Spirit, the long-range stealth bomber presented by Northrop Grumman in 1989. The structural similarity is undeniable. Both share the wing geometry without tail, the rounded edges, and the integration of engines within the wing to reduce the radar footprint. The principles of the Ho 229 are also reflected in contemporary aircraft such as the Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk, first operational stealth fighter, and in reconnaissance drones such as the RQ-170 Sentinel. All of them apply the Horten philosophy, to disperse or absorb radar waves by means of angular shapes and composite materials. What in 1944 was an experiment ahead of its time became decades later the norm of modern military aviation. Today, the only surviving exemplar of the Ho 229 Phi 3 is preserved in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., where specialists from the Garber Center have restored part of its structure. Visitors can see the original wooden surface with remains of the dark coating that, according to tests carried out in 2008 by engineers from the museum itself and from Northrop Grumman, confirmed its capacity to reduce radar detection. Although the Ho 229 never came to combat, it represents the transition between 2 eras, that of conventional propeller flight and that of the supersonic jet. In barely 1 decade, Germany went from manufacturing fabric biplanes to designing aircraft that anticipated the engineering of the 21st century. The short history of the project summarizes the desperate technological impulse of a regime that bet on innovation as a last resort. Type 21 submarine, the design that redefined immersion operation. In mid-1943, the war in the Atlantic had changed. German submarines, which for years dominated the maritime routes, began to fall one after another under the pressure of Allied technology. The new radars, sonar and aerial surveillance made it almost impossible to move without being detected. In few weeks, Admiral Karl Dönitz lost tens of units. The Kriegsmarine understood that its old models could no longer compete and that its U-boats, forced to surface to recharge batteries, had become too vulnerable. In that context emerged the project that would change submarine warfare forever, the Type 21, also called Electroboot. The design was driven by engineers Brocking Fritz and Friedrich Schürer under supervision of the shipyards Blohm and Voss, A.G. Weser and Schickau. Partially inspired by Helmuth Walter's experimental prototypes, which used hydrogen peroxide turbines, they sought a transition model that could be manufactured quickly without depending on such a complex system. They decided to create a submarine with double the batteries of the previous ones, a cleaner hydrodynamic hull and a snorkel system to operate its diesel engines without completely emerging. The result was a vessel capable of navigating submerged for days and reaching speeds previously unthinkable underwater. In June of 1943, the plans were presented to the High Command. Dönitz approved them immediately. Construction began in 1944. Each submarine was manufactured in 8 prefabricated sections that were then joined in the main shipyards. That method sought to accelerate production, but the lack of experience of some contracted companies caused quality problems. Even so, between 1943 and 1945, 118 units were completed, although only 4 were ready for combat before the end of the war. The U-2501 was the first unit launched, followed by the U-3008 and the U-2513. With a displacement of 1,610 tons and a length of almost 77 meters, the Type 21 was larger than the classic 7C, but much faster. Submerged, it reached 17.2 knots and in silent mode maintained 6 knots for several hours. It could travel 340 nautical miles underwater at 5 knots, something 3 or 4 times superior to previous models. On surface, its range was of 15,500 nautical miles at 10 knots. The new hull, hydrodynamic and without the angular lines of the old submarines, improved immersion speed and allowed a quieter interior operation. The crew of 57 men worked in a wider interior with refrigeration compartments, double bunks and centralized electrical control. For the first time, a submarine was really conceived to operate under the sea for long periods. The propulsion system combined 2 supercharged man-diesel engines of 6 cylinders and 2 main double-action electric motors, plus another 2 silent motors for maneuvers. The snorkel installed in the mast allowed to aspirate atmospheric air and expel gases while the ship remained at periscopic depth, making it unnecessary to completely emerge to recharge batteries. The armament was also innovative. It carried 6 533mm torpedo tubes in the bow, with a hydraulic system that allowed to reload them in minutes. It could launch 18 torpedoes in less than 20 minutes. The passive sonar was one of the most sensitive of its time, and the automatic fire control system reduced attack times. The whole set represented a generation ahead compared to any existing fleet. The shipyards of Hamburg, Bremen and Danzig worked day and night to fulfill the orders of the Ministry of Armament, directed by Albert Speer. However, the pressure of time and Allied bombings affected production. In Farge, near Bremen, the gigantic Valentine bunker was erected, an underground concrete base destined to assemble the Type 21 massively. More than 10,000 prisoners of war and deportees from concentration camps were forced to work there. In March of 1945, the structure was almost finished when it was destroyed by British seismic bombs. The end of the war arrived before the new model could demonstrate all its potential. Only some submarines, like the U-2511 and the U-3008, carried out real patrols. The first, commanded by Adalbert Schnee, departed towards the Atlantic in April of 1945 and detected an Allied convoy near Scotland, but did not fire upon learning of Germany's surrender. Few days later, it was delivered in Bergen. When the Allies occupied the shipyards, they found dozens of half-built hulls. The astonishment was immediate. The Type 21 represented a technological leap of 1 decade. The United States, the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union divided the finished exemplars. The U-2513 and the U-3008 were delivered to the US Navy. The U-2518 passed to the French Marine Nationale with the name Roland Moriot, and several more, like the U-3035 and the U-3041, were integrated into the Soviet Navy. The victorious powers copied its technology. In the United States, naval engineers of the Fleet Submarine Program adopted its design to create the Tang and Barbel classes, incorporating high-capacity batteries and hulls optimized for underwater speed. In the Soviet Union, the project was replicated in the Whiskey, Zulu and Foxtrot class submarines, which dominated the seas during the Cold War. France maintained the Roland Morilot in active service until 1967. The legacy of the Type 21 also influenced the development of nuclear submarines. Its hydrodynamic shape, with integrated tower and crossed rudders, was the base of the first Soviet and American reactors. Although nuclear propulsion eliminated air dependence, the structural logic, fluidity of lines, noise reduction and prolonged underwater life was born with this model. One of the last German exemplars, the U-2540, was refloated in 1957 and renamed Wilhelm Bauer. It served as a test vessel for the Deutsche Marine until 1982, and today is preserved as a museum in Bremerhaven. Its restored interior allows to observe the original electrical system, the batteries and the control post that represented the peak of naval engineering of its time. Unlike previous submarines, which were weapons of rapid attack and escape, the Type 21 could remain submerged for prolonged missions. In a certain way, it was the first strategic submarine. Its modern descendants, the U-212, Skorpion, Kilo, Gotland and Soryu, preserved the same philosophy. Diesel-electric propulsion with advanced batteries, optimized hull and acoustic stealth systems. All of them derive ultimately from that revolution initiated in 1944. Its technical configuration, developed in German shipyards in the last years of the conflict, became the base of the diesel-electric submarines that today integrate fleets worldwide. Wasserfall, the precursor of guided anti-aircraft missiles. From 1941, while Allied bombers expanded their range and frequency, German air defense began to show its limits. Anti-aircraft batteries no longer reached the height of the new bombers, and the Luftwaffe lacked pilots and fuel to sustain traditional interception. Enemy technological superiority became evident in each attack. It was then when, in the laboratories of Peenemünde, a group of engineers headed by Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger initiated a project that broke with all previous solutions. A guided missile designed specifically to shoot down aircraft at high altitude. They called it Wasserfall, waterfall. The project began in 1941, when Dornberger proposed to adapt the V-2 rocket technology for air defense. The idea was to manufacture a smaller and more controllable version that could be launched from land to shoot down bombers. The new missile would have a length of about 7 meters and an approximate weight of 3.5 tons, that is, a fourth part of the V-2. It had to reach a speed close to 790 meters per second and operate at an altitude of 18 kilometers, sufficient to intercept enemy formations. From the beginning, the Wasserfall was conceived as a remote-controlled missile. Unlike the V-2, which used liquid oxygen as an oxidizer, the Wasserfall needed to remain armed for weeks without maintenance. For this, the chemist Walter Thiel developed a liquid fuel engine fed with red-fuming nitric acid and a vinylic fuel called Visol. That combination could be stored for a long time without risk of evaporation or freezing, something impossible with previous rockets. It was enough to activate the electrical system for it to be ready for launch. Its aerodynamic structure was simple but efficient. It conserved the body of the V-2, although shorter, with an additional pair of stabilizing fins in the middle of the fuselage to increase maneuverability. At the tip, it carried a high-explosive warhead of 235 kilograms equipped with a proximity fuse, which could be detonated manually from land during the day or automatically in night operations. The guidance system, designed by the Flakversuchskommando Nord, was manual radio control, MCLOS. The operator observed both the missile and the target by means of radars that projected 2 marks on a screen. His task was to match both signals using a joystick, transmitting orders to the actuators that moved the aerodynamic rudders. Although rudimentary, this method anticipated the principle of remote command missiles. The first tests began in March of 1943, but the development suffered a hard blow few months later when a RAF bombing destroyed part of Peenemünde and caused the death of Walter Thiel. The program was delayed more than 1 year. The first partially successful launch occurred on the 8th of January of 1944, when the missile reached 7 kilometers of height before its engine failed. Throughout 1944 and beginning of 1945, about 40 launches were carried out, of which barely 15 were considered satisfactory. Despite the problems, the potential of the project was evident. It was the first anti-aircraft weapon capable of flying at supersonic speed. Towards the end of 1944, 3 versions of the rocket were tested, denominated W1, W5 and W10. Each new variant incorporated improvements in the electrical and control systems. The final model, the W10, measured 6.13 meters long and could attack targets at 25 kilometers of distance. It was planned to produce it in mass and deploy it around Berlin, Hamburg and the Ruhr, but the collapse of the Reich prevented any operative battery from functioning. The defense complex included a fixed launcher, tracking radars, radio transmitters, and a control console. In theory, a Wasserfall battery could protect a radius of 50 kilometers, but in practice the system suffered interferences, and the available radars could not discriminate targets well, especially against Allied electronic countermeasures. With factories under attack and resources exhausted, the project was officially cancelled on the 6th of February of 1945. After the German surrender, all documents and prototypes were captured by the victorious powers. The United States transferred several exemplars and part of the technical team within Operation Paperclip. The Soviets did the same within the framework of their R-101 program. Both countries studied in detail the technology of fuels, engines, and guidance systems. In American laboratories, its design served as a base for the Hermes A-1 missile, developed by General Electric, while the Soviets used it as a starting point for the S-25 Berkut, first long-range air defense system of the USSR. The Hermes, tested in 1947, conserved the propulsion system and the general structure of the Wasserfall, although it incorporated automatic radar control. Although it never entered service, it provided the experimental base for the Nike Ajax and Nike Hercules surface-to-air missiles, operative in the 1950s. From them derived the Patriot systems of the United States, still active in the actuality. In the Soviet Union, the knowledge acquired with the R-101 derived in missiles that culminated in the S-75 Dvina, famous for shooting down the American U-2 in 1960, and later in the modern S-300 and S-400. The technical legacy of the Wasserfall was more valuable than its military performance. Its single-chamber engine, capable of maintaining the mixture stable for 45 seconds, introduced concepts of prolonged storage that would later be applied to intercontinental missiles. Its radio guidance anticipated later remote command systems, and its modular structure facilitated the development of mobile batteries. In practical terms, it was the first guided anti-aircraft missile in history, although it did not come to enter combat. The only partially preserved exemplar is found in the National Museum of the United States Air Force, disassembled for study. Its compact appearance and its triangular fins show the intermediate point between a tactical missile and a research rocket. Engineering tests carried out decades later confirmed the efficiency of its design and the stability of the binary fuel invented by Thiel. From its technology were born automatic anti-aircraft systems, area defense missiles, and ultimately modern interceptors that today protect entire cities. In each radar that guides a Patriot missile or in each sensor of an S-400 persists the logic that German engineers imagined in Peenemünde to detect, follow, and destroy a target from a distance. Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet, the rocket plane that changed aeronautics. At the beginning of the 1940s, while Allied air superiority became increasingly clear, a radical concept emerged in Germany. Alexander Lippisch, an engineer specialized in delta wings, proposed an airplane without propeller propelled exclusively by a liquid rocket engine. The idea, developed when he still worked at the German Institute for Glider Research, DFS, caught the attention of the Air Ministry, which transferred him to Messerschmitt AG to convert his prototypes into a real interceptor. Thus was born the project that would culminate in the Me 163 Comet, the first operational rocket plane in history. The origin of the program dates back to 1937, when Lippisch experimented with the DFS-39, a delta-wing glider designed to reduce aerodynamic drag to a minimum. Its evolution, the prototype DFS-194, performed planned flights in 1939, demonstrating stability and maneuverability. 1 year later, the apparatus received a Walter HWKR 203 engine based on concentrated hydrogen peroxide. The results convinced the authorities to boost the development of the Me 163 under Messerschmitt's control. The new aircraft was an absolute break with the aeronautics of its time. Its fuselage was compact and clean, with trapezoidal wings integrated into a single structure. The cockpit was advanced and protected, and the Walter engine installed in the rear provided a thrust superior to 1,500 kilograms, allowing speeds close to 900 kilometers per hour, impossible figures for any aircraft of 1941. The fuel, a mixture of T-Stoff, concentrated hydrogen peroxide, and C-Stoff, hydrazine and methanol, made the preparation of the apparatus extremely dangerous. Technicians had to work with special suits, and any leak could trigger violent reactions that cost the lives of several pilots and mechanics. Even so, the project advanced. In 1941, the Me 163 Phi-1 performed its first propelled flight in Peenemünde, widely exceeding speed expectations. In 1943, the Luftwaffe authorized the production of the Me 163B1, a model with a more reliable Walter HWK 109-509 engine and a detachable landing gear. It took off on a trolley that was released after ascent and landed with a retractable skid. The Comet's performance was extraordinary. It ascended almost vertically up to 12,000 meters in barely a few minutes and attacked with two 30mm cannons. However, its autonomy was limited to about 7 minutes of propelled flight, after which it had to glide to its base, at which point it remained vulnerable. The very high speed made aiming difficult. The pilot barely had 2 or 3 seconds to align the enemy bomber in the sight. In 1944, the Erprobungskommando 16 began to operate the Me 163 from Bad Zwischenahn. The reports confirmed its ascensional performance and the complexity of its use. Although about 370 units were built, less than 100 were ready for combat. Its operational debut occurred in May of 1944, shooting down a B-17 near Leipzig, but losses due to failures surpassed confirmed shoot-downs. Attempts to equip it with automatic air-to-air weapons, such as the Jagdfaust system, did not come to be completed before the end of the war. With the collapse of the Reich, the project was suspended in 1945. The Allies captured several exemplars, included motorless training models, Me 163S, and transferred engineers and components for their analysis. In the United States, the experience accumulated with the Comet directly influenced the Bell X-1, the airplane that would break the sound barrier in 1947. In the Soviet Union, prototypes such as the Mikoyan-Gurevich An-270 and the Bi-1 incorporated part of its compact architecture and its concept of rocket-propelled ascent. The aerodynamic innovations of the Me 163 extended beyond the military scope. Its delta wing would serve as a base for supersonic aircraft such as the Mirage fighters, the F-102 Delta Dagger, and, decades later, the Space Shuttle. It also contributed to the development of high-temperature resistant materials and high-speed controlled gliding techniques, fundamental in aerospace engineering. Alexander Lippisch continued his career in the United States, where he applied his studies to the Convair XF-92A prototype, and later to the F-102 and F-106 fighters, consolidating the delta wing as a standard for high-performance aircraft. The Walter 509 engine introduced concepts such as turbopump feeding, pressurized injection and hypergolic mixtures, which would later form part of the first Western experimental rocket programs. The Me 163 marked a turning point between conventional aviation and spaceflight. It demonstrated that an airplane could ascend without depending on air for propulsion, and that extreme aerodynamics could be controlled in transonic regimes. Its experimental data, obtained at the cost of numerous accidents, were essential for the development of hypersonic test vehicles. Today, exemplars are preserved in the Imperial War Museum in London, the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and the Deutsches Museum in Munich. In them is appreciated the mixture of genius and risk that defined the Comet, a machine ahead of its time, but condemned by the dangers of its fuel and by a strategic environment that it could no longer save. Pressure suits, from the Reich's laboratories to outer space. During the 1930s, military aviation began to reach heights that surpassed the limits of the human body. At more than 10,000 meters of altitude, atmospheric pressure decreases so much that bodily fluids begin to boil, oxygen becomes insufficient, and the pilot can lose consciousness in seconds. The Luftwaffe understood soon that conquering altitude was also a physiological question. While its engineers designed airplanes capable of flying higher and faster, a reduced group of doctors and researchers concentrated on a fundamental question: how to keep the pilot alive and operative in an environment that no longer belonged to Earth. In the Institute of Aeronautical Medicine of Berlin, directed by specialists like Wilhelm Pfannenstiel, a research program was initiated aimed at protecting the human body against decompression. German scientists knew that supplementary oxygen was not enough. The organism needed a stable environmental pressure. Thus emerged the concept of the pressurized flight suit, a hermetic envelope that would compress the body in a controlled manner, ensuring the flow of oxygen and the minimum mobility necessary to pilot. The first prototypes, developed in collaboration with the Dragewerke company, known for its diving and industrial breathing equipment, were articulated metallic structures, closer to an armor than to a garment. This initial model, experimentally designated as 1033, incorporated flexible joints that maintained constant pressure on the extremities and torso. Although rigid and difficult to place, it allowed for the first time that pilots could withstand simulated altitudes superior to 12,000 meters in hyperbaric chambers without losing consciousness. The principle had worked. Subsequent trials replaced the metallic frame with layers of reinforced rubber with synthetic fabrics. From that work was born the Drage 191, a suit that combined pressure-regulating valves, oxygen ducts, and a more adaptable structure to human movement. Test flights demonstrated that respiratory function could be maintained in extreme conditions, reducing episodes of hypoxia and decompression. This design became the basis of all subsequent developments. As the war advanced, operational needs changed. Reconnaissance flights had to exceed 10,000 meters to evade anti-aircraft artillery, and pilots required equipment that offered thermal protection and stable pressure for long periods. Thus appeared the Höhenfluganzug 1069, which integrated thermal insulation, pressurization, and a portable oxygen system. Technical reports confirmed that aviators could withstand conditions that previously were fatal. However, the high cost and complexity of the equipment prevented its mass production. In 1943, with the Reich's resources increasingly scarce, engineers tried to simplify the design. Then emerged the Model 1070, built with synthetic fabrics and lower-cost components. It was lighter and could be assembled quickly, although it offered limited pressurization. These suits were used in high-altitude missions over the Eastern Front, where the thin atmosphere and extreme cold constituted perfect tests for their materials. In parallel, experiments were carried out with partially pressurized cabins, but the development did not manage to consolidate before the end of the conflict. When Germany surrendered, the Allies found in the archives of the Luftwaffe and of Dragewerke tens of medical reports, plans, and prototypes. All that material was transferred to the United States and to the United Kingdom. In the Wright Field Base, American engineers analyzed the valve systems, the hermetic seals, and the applied physiology that the Germans had rigorously documented. Those studies became the starting point for North American research on altitude suits, described years later in NASA's historical report, Dressing for Altitude. During the decade of the 1950s, those knowledges were applied directly to the design of the pressure suits used in experimental flights and high-performance airplanes. Engineers of projects such as the Bell X-1 and the X-15 adapted the German solutions of pressure containment by means of superimposed layers of elastic materials, automatic valves, and internal ventilation systems. The suits of the U-2 and SR-71 pilots inherited that same technical architecture, finally evolving into the spacesuits of Project Mercury, which inaugurated the era of orbital flights. The Soviet Union also incorporated information from the documents captured in Germany. Its aeronautical medicine programs developed pressure suits for the first cosmonauts, such as Yuri Gagarin, based on the same principle of internal pressure balance and controlled oxygenation. With time, both Soviet and American suits evolved towards complete life support systems, capable of keeping human beings alive in the vacuum. Today, the suits used by NASA and ESA astronauts maintain the same purpose that drove those experiments in Berlin, to create an artificial frontier that allows the human body to survive where the atmosphere ceases to be viable. The layers of polymers, the automatic oxygen systems, and the electronic controllers replace the rudimentary valves of the past, but preserve the fundamental logic established during the war, to provide a stable environment by means of pressure, temperature, and oxygenation control. Zuse Z3, the German computer that initiated the digital era. During the most intense years of the Second World War, while Germany concentrated its technical talent on military machinery, a Berlin civil engineer worked in silence on an invention that would transform the course of modern science. His name was Konrad Zuse, and his creation, the Z3, would become the first programmable and completely functional computer in the world. Conceived in 1941 in a small workshop in Berlin, it represented the birth of modern computing at the very moment the continent was sinking into war. Zuse had studied civil engineering at the Technical University of Berlin and soon grew tired of the endless structural calculations he had to perform by hand. In the Henschel Flugzeugwerke company, a bomber manufacturer, he spent entire days repeating operations with slide rules. Convinced that a machine could take care of these tasks more quickly and accurately, he began to design an automatic system based on binary processes. In 1936, he built in his living room the Z1, an experimental, totally mechanical machine that already contained the essential principles of a computer: a logical unit, a memory and a program controlled by punched tape. Although fragile, it represented an idea ahead of its time. 2 years later, he created the Z2, which replaced mechanical parts with electromechanical relays, increasing reliability and speed. This model caught the attention of the Luftwaffe, interested in aerodynamic and ballistic calculations, although they never granted him complete official support. In 1941, he managed to culminate his greatest work, the Z3. Built with more than 2,000 telephone relays, it operated at a frequency of 5 Hz and used 22-bit words. It could perform multiplications in 3 seconds and divisions in 5, and its operation was controlled by a perforated celluloid tape that allowed changing instructions without modifying the hardware. Unlike any calculator of the time, it was totally digital and programmable. Each order was executed sequentially, following a logical set of instructions that anticipated the principle of the stored program, the basis of all modern computing. Compared to contemporary machines such as the British Colossus or the American Atanasoff Berry, the Z3 stood out because it was general purpose and could solve different types of mathematical problems, not just specific decryption or artillery tasks. The wartime context prevented the Z3 from having immediate repercussions. The Reich's resources were destined for war, not for automation. However, tests demonstrated its effectiveness. In 1943, Zuse was already working on an improved version, the Z4, when Allied bombings destroyed his workshop and the original Z3. Despite the loss, the project's principles survived. In 1945, with Germany in ruins, he rescued his notes and rebuilt his machine in a small workshop. 4 years later, he moved it to Switzerland, where the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich used it for 1 decade. It was the first operational computer in Europe and the only one in operation outside the United States in the immediate post-war. In 1949, Zuse founded his own company, Zuse KG, dedicated to manufacturing commercial computers. The Z11 and Z22 models incorporated electronic valves and later transistors, marking the step towards industrial computing. Although international fame fell on the American ENIAC and EDVAC projects, the scientific community recognized that the Z3 had been the first programmable digital computer according to modern standards. His contribution was not limited to hardware. In 1945, he developed the Plankalkül, the first high-level programming language, with data structures, loops, and subroutines. Even without being published until decades later, it laid the foundations of modern programming. During the 1950s and 1960s, Zuse's ideas were taken up by large corporations. IBM applied his principles to the first commercial computers, while in Germany, his machines were used in universities and engineering companies. He received the Werner von Siemens Prize in 1967, and 2 years later he was incorporated into the Academy of Sciences of West Berlin. His definitive recognition came with the functional replica of the Z3 preserved in the Deutsches Museum in Munich, and with the creation of the Zuse Institut Berlin, dedicated to research in scientific computing. In 2017, several European institutions remembered the anniversary of his invention, highlighting the magnitude of the achievement of a single engineer who, in the midst of war, gave origin to the digital era. The Z3 was more than a machine. It was the first tangible manifestation of electronic thought. While the world was destroying itself with weapons, Zuse was building a tool for thinking. Its purpose was not military, but logical. The binary structure, modular programming, and the separation between memory and calculation introduced by its design are still valid in every current device. From microprocessors to smartphones, everything works under the same principle, born in that Berlin basement in 1941. The legacy of Konrad Zuse transcended the limits of the Third Reich and opened the way towards digital civilization. In parallel to that silent advance, the company Carl Zeiss AG, based in Jena, developed some of the most precise optical instruments of its time. During the war, its factories produced artillery sights, periscopes, aerial reconnaissance cameras, and magnifying lenses for the German army. Zeiss engineers, in collaboration with Zeiss Icon, perfected the manufacturing of photographic objectives and observation systems equipped with unprecedented anti-reflective coatings that increased light transmission. The Luftwaffe used these optics in reconnaissance aircraft, and Kriegsmarine submarines depended on the periscopes designed in Jena to detect enemies on the high seas. After the end of the conflict, Zeiss's facilities were divided. Part of the personnel and equipment were transferred to Oberkochen in West Germany, while the original plant remained under Soviet control. From that division were born two companies that over the years would collaborate again. The engineers evacuated to the west preserved the plans and accumulated experience, which served as a basis for post-war optics. The discoveries made in those laboratories became the backbone of photography and microscopy of the 20th century. Zeiss introduced polishing and chromatic correction methods that revolutionized biological observation and cinematography. The first 35mm camera lenses, projection lenses, and precision microscopes were born from that technical impulse. The technical continuity of Zeiss is appreciated today in high-precision optical instruments, from microscopes and telescopes to professional cameras and systems integrated into electronic devices. The principles that sustain that quality, lens configuration, anti-reflective coatings and calibration processes, derive directly from the developments made during the war. Pervitin, the drug that kept Hitler's army awake. In a small laboratory in Berlin, emerged a substance destined to redefine the relationship between the human body and modern war. In the Temmler Werk facilities, a group of chemists synthesized a crystalline version of methamphetamine that received the commercial name of Pervitin. In its beginnings, it was presented as a domestic stimulant aimed at students, housewives, and exhausted workers. It was sold without prescription in pharmacies, in decorative bottles and in white tablets that promised energy, mental clarity, and optimism. Nobody imagined that it would soon transform into a combat tool. The chemist Friedrich Hauschild had obtained the compound in 1937, perfecting methods developed in Japan and the United States. Its formula was based on methamphetamine, a derivative of ephedrine that, by acting directly on the central nervous system, generated a sensation of euphoria and suppressed fatigue. The first German medical reports qualified it as a useful advance in cases of depression or physical exhaustion. However, the Nazi regime quickly understood that its effects could have a military purpose. The physiologist Otto Friedrich Ranke, from the Institute of Physiology of the Military Medical Academy, was the one who proposed its systematic use in the army. Convinced that a soldier's performance could be chemically increased, he initiated tests with Wehrmacht cadets. The results were so conclusive that in 1939 the drug began to be officially distributed among the troops. In few months, millions of Pervitin tablets circulated through the fronts. The boxes carried the Temmler Werk brand and were distributed along with daily rations. Each tablet promised to stay awake for 48 hours, reduce fear and increase concentration. During the invasion of Poland, commanders reported that troops could advance without stopping, crossing kilometers of terrain without sleeping. In 1940, during the offensive against France, methamphetamine became a silent component of the Blitzkrieg. Tank drivers, truck drivers, artillery operators, and bomber pilots received the tablets before operations. The command saw in it a tactical advantage, an army that never rested. Production statistics were enormous. Between April and June of 1940, more than 35 million doses of Pervitin were distributed only for the French campaign. Dr. Ranke recommended between 1 and 2 daily tablets, although soldiers usually consumed more. Some even combined them with coffee and alcohol to intensify the effects. What seemed a source of power ended in many cases in nervous collapse. When the effects disappeared, tremors, paranoia, and devastating fatigue appeared. The drug had become an integral part of military logistics. Shipments from Temmler Werk arrived at all fronts: Western Europe, the Balkans, and later the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe also received special shipments for its pilots, especially those participating in night missions. Squadron doctors reported that aviators under Pervitin withstood long-duration flights without showing tiredness, but some suffered panic attacks and calculation errors upon landing. Even so, the command continued authorizing its use, convinced that the benefit outweighed the risk. The success of the substance became a health problem. Field hospitals began to receive soldiers with symptoms of dependence and cardiac alterations. In 1941, the Reich's medical authorities officially recognized the addictive effects of Pervitin and included it in a list of controlled substances. From then on, its distribution was limited to medical orders, but reserves were already so abundant that it continued circulating among the troops. On the Eastern Front, where marches and combats were endless, methamphetamine continued to be part of the basic equipment. Many soldiers considered it as essential as ammunition or bread. The Temmler-Werke company became one of the most lucrative in the Reich. Its plant in Berlin employed hundreds of workers and operated day and night to satisfy military demand. Reports from the time show how Pervitin production was integrated into the war economy as a strategic resource. Although the High Command tried to control its distribution, the reality of the front made it impossible. Commanders maintained secret reserves for their units, and some military doctors prescribed it as an improvised analgesic. Towards the end of the war, when defeats began to multiply, consumption increased. Exhausted soldiers resorted to the stimulant to withstand retreats and the inhuman conditions of winter. In shelters, the tablets were mixed with morphine or alcohol, which aggravated the side effects. In 1945, hospitals registered cases of psychosis, hallucinations, and cardiac failures derived from abuse. Despite this, Pervitin never completely disappeared. The same substance that had sustained the Blitzkrieg remained present, clandestinely, in post-war Germany. During the 1950s, methamphetamine continued to be produced under sanitary control. Temmler-Werke itself resumed manufacturing it, although with other medical presentations. In the Federal Republic of Germany, it was prescribed to treat depression and chronic fatigue, until in 1988 it was finally withdrawn from the market. Its formula, however, survived in illegal laboratories throughout Europe and later in the United States, where it transformed into what is known today as crystal meth. The chemical legacy of Pervitin marked the origin of modern therapeutic amphetamines. Its molecular structure inspired drugs such as Adderall or Dexedrine, used in treatments for attention deficit or narcolepsy. The same principles that in war served to keep soldiers awake are today used in medicine to regulate attention and energy. The passage from the battlefield to the doctor's office summarizes how a drug born from the war effort ended up integrated into civil life. Beyond its pharmacological evolution, Pervitin represents one of the most revealing expressions of total war, an attempt to extend the biological limits of the human being through chemistry. Millions of men marched under its effect, believing that strength came from their will, when in reality it was the product of a white powder designed in a laboratory. The science that should improve life ended up being used to keep awake those who fought in an endless war. And from that paradox emerged a heritage that still persists, hidden in the same molecules that one day propelled the most reckless army of the 20th century. At the end of the war, many of these developments continued to be used. What was born as part of the military effort passed to form part of industry, medicine, and civil technology. The inventions created in that time did not disappear. They changed use and continue present in different forms until today.